It is my pleasure to welcome you to this webinar sponsored by the Higher Education Committee of the 100 Black Men of America. Today, we're going to be discussing two very important topics, looking at social justice and diversity, and also virtual learning and distance education. Before we get into the introductions of the panelists, we have the chair of the K through 12 committee, Dr. Floyd Rose, who will bring us greetings on behalf of that committee and the 100. Dr. Rose.
Thank you, Dr. Silver. On behalf of Chairman Tommy Dortch, the Executive Committee, and Board of Directors of the 100 Black Men of America, and our more than 100 affiliate chapters, it is an honor and a privilege to welcome you to the 100 Black Men of America's Higher Education Committee White Paper webinar. The lively and timely discussion you are about to experience is a product of more than a year's research by some of the most notable educators in our country, involving vital concerns of our community. The two topics of dialogue that will be addressed during this webinar are increasing diversity and social justice in higher education in a historical context of the past, the present, and the future, and the incorporation of virtual learning in the wake of COVID-19, involving the understanding of distance learning, its barriers and challenges for both students and faculty. The discussion that you will hear has been designed to be relevant, constructive, and focused, and provide clarity and a deeper understanding of the issues. Again, welcome and please enjoy.
Thank you, Dr. Rose, for those words of welcome and greetings. We certainly appreciate all that you're doing to help K through 12 and the 100 address those issues at that level. Today, I have the privilege of working with a series of great individuals who have been working all year long on this particular task. The two topics that we're discussing: diversity and social justice, and distance learning and virtual education. So I'm going to ask each one of them to introduce themselves, a little short introduction. I'll call on you, and as I call on you, as you appear on my screen, just give a little bit about your background, and then we're going to move directly into the program. So we're going to start with Dr. Johnny Brown.
Good evening. I'm delighted to participate as part of this panel and discussion. I'm part of the Beaumont, Texas chapter. I've served as superintendent in 4 school districts across the nation and many of the years of my career. Currently, I'm an adjunct professor at Lamar University in Beaumont.
Dr. Mcneil.
Greetings all, I'm Terrence Mcneil. I'm an assistant professor at Tennessee State University, where I work in the Educational Leadership Department in the College of Education. Very pleased and delighted to join my colleagues here this evening in this discussion on these very critical issues. I was initiated into the 100 Black Men in Tallahassee, Florida chapter, and I currently reside in Nashville, Tennessee.
Thank you, sir. Dr. Roland Smith, Jr.
Good evening, all. Yes, it's great to be here. I am the Associate Provost for Diversity and Inclusion and Adjunct Professor of Sociology at Rice University. I'm also a member of the Metropolitan Houston chapter of the 100 Black Men, and I'll be retiring soon.
Is that why you have that big smile on your face, sir?
After 25 years.
Yes, Mr. Hardy.
Good evening. I'm Charlie E. Hardy. I'm professor of marketing management, Alabama State University. It's my delight to be a part of this panel, 100 Black Men of America. We hope that it will make a difference in what you plan to do going forward.
Thank you so very much. Dr. Joseph Jones.
Good evening, all. My name is Jones. I am actually just trained to Atlanta, where I'll be as an associate professor of political at Atlanta University. My affiliation with the 100 Black Men in the Greater Little Rock chapter in Arkansas. We'll be transitioning to the Atlanta chapter this fall. And so I look forward to the conversation and the dialogue.
Thank you. Dr. Robert Yancey.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Robert Yancey. I am Professor Emeritus at Kennesaw State University, former founding dean of the School of Management at Southern Polytechnic State University. And I have had the privilege of teaching at a number of historically Black colleges, including Southern University, Albany State College, Hampton Institute when it was the Institute, and Clark Atlanta University when it was Atlanta University. I'm a member of the Atlanta chapter of 100 Black Men of Atlanta, and I'm delighted to be here.
Thank you, sir. Dr. Derek Rivera.
Thank you, Dr. Silver. I'm Derek Rivera. I serve currently as the Vice Provost for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Louisiana State University. I also serve as the National President for the American Association of Blacks in Higher Education. Prior to my tenure at LSU, I had a 25-year career at Xavier University down in New Orleans. I am a member of the Metropolitan Baton Rouge chapter.
All right. Dr. John Kuykendall.
Good evening, John Kirkendall. I am currently serving as Dean of the School of Education at the University of Indianapolis, where I oversee the teacher education programs and the educational leadership programs there. Happy to be a part of this group tonight and have a serious conversation around social justice and diversity. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, gentlemen, for that, for those introductions. I am absolutely pleased to be on the panel with you. Again, I'm Joseph Silver, and I'm actually a member of the Savannah chapter of the 100. And I have the privilege of serving as chair of the Higher Education Committee of the 100 Black Men of America. To get us started off, we're going to give a summary of the papers. As I indicated, this group has been working on the papers for a better part of a year on these very important topics, very timely topics. And so we're going to have Dr. Johnny Brown to give us a summary of the diversity and inclusion paper, and then we're going to have Dr. Joseph Jones to give us a summary of the distance learning and virtual learning paper, and then we're going to engage the audience in a back and forth at the end of our presentation. But immediately after the introductions or the summaries, we're going to engage the panelists in a series of questions to cover a broad range of topics, but to make sure that we give you information that would be pertinent to your chapters, pertinent to your communities, and pertinent to the organizations that you belong to. So Dr. Johnny Brown, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Silver. I'm delighted to join this distinguished and well-celebrated committee in presenting a brief summary of the scholarly white paper, Increasing Diversity and Social Justice in Higher Education. The paper is about the continuing march toward ensuring civil and human rights, equity, equality, and excellence for all, and increasing opportunities with special focus on faculty, staff, students in the higher education community. We reviewed the available research and organized the findings through these relevant subcategories: historical context, campus leadership, faculty and student diversity, ideas, programs, and practice for student success, areas of concern and challenges, why diversity and social justice matter in connection with higher education, and what difference students can make in this arena. So what is diversity? As reflected in research by Clayton Peterson et al., it is participation by a group of people of differing backgrounds and experiences, basically everybody, including individual and group and social differences such as learning styles, race, ethnicity, class, gender, sexual orientation, and sexual identity, country of origin, religious affiliations, and more. Inclusion, also shared by Clayton Peterson et al., refers to policies and practices that are in place to ensure active and intentional opportunities for and engagement by all students within and across all areas of school life. Campus leadership and faculty considerations. In addressing diversity and social justice, we reported in this paper that leadership is essential from the Board of Trustees and Regents and the President to lead to deep and lasting changes in terms of progress on campus. And it's very helpful to engage faculty positions such as Chief Diversity Officer, and not just a position where this person would report to the President or Board of Trustees officers with authority to make decisions, and where there's resources available and staff. There's plenty of evidence to support that a strongly diverse faculty affects teaching and learning in higher education. So student diversity, why does it matter? Research studies consistently and widely reflect that it is important for students to learn from peers who have enjoyed different experiences and backgrounds. In fact, our learning is limited, as we all know, when we are in a homogeneous group of like-minded individuals with similar experiences and beliefs. Further, the effects are very positive when students work with people from other races, ethnicities, and cultural backgrounds and challenge their views they are accustomed to. Campus diversity challenges stereotypes because students are most often raised around people of similar socioeconomic, racial, or cultural characteristics. When presented with opportunities to critically explore and reflect upon their childhood experiences, students can become more accepting, more tolerant, and thoughtful members of society. And in addition, students can see themselves in their leaders. For many students who attend institutions that seriously address diversity, it's a chance to see models from similar backgrounds whom they can emulate. And also, diverse environments better prepare students for the workforce. What about social justice? Generally, social justice is the pursuit of an expectation for equity, access, opportunities to participate, civil and human rights, and distribution of wealth and privileges in school and in general in society. Anna Jones, 2019, shared with us, this is not new. For generations, African Americans and other minority groups have consistently fought for the key principles of social justice: access to resources, equity, participation, human civil rights, and dealing with the impact of economic disenfranchisement, voter suppression, mass incarceration, unequal education, and other disparate treatment of historically marginalized people. And now please remember, the first step in doing something special about social injustice is what? To acknowledge that it exists. And on social injustice, it's also very important for engagement by adults as well as for our youth in terms of sharing and supporting social justice and civil rights causes, and making sure that we're educated, adults and youth, and share what you've learned by social media and within various groups that you may be part. Let me summarize just a few highlights of things that can make a difference, and this would include new institutions and PWI institutions as well. Steps that all schools can and should take. Put your money where your mouth is, where your policies state that you're going to be supportive of diversity. Provide financial support. Offer child care options to support students and families, Make sure that you have a marketing campaign to share pride in the diversity of your campus. Establish and monitor goals and objectives in a diversity plan. Review and revise your policies and practices and manuals to ensure that each document and plan is non-discriminatory and welcoming for a diverse student body. Ensure your website and social media reports reflect what the school stands for in terms of promotion of diversity. Publish documents that reflect diversity, respect, and inclusion on campus and in the community. Hold meetings periodically with diverse campus population to listen to students' points of view on campus and make appropriate adjustments as may be needed to reflect what the school stands for. Conduct faculty training programs to ensure the importance of student diversity and ensuring a welcome environment for students and faculty. Maintain a recruitment program budgeted adequately for aggressive recruitment of a diverse group of students. Conduct community town hall meetings to ensure alignment among the college and community on treatment of students and positive interactions on and on and on. Maintain mentoring and academic tutoring and counseling support for students. Implement programs designed to facilitate and enhance students' transition from high school to college and toward graduation. Establish student podcasts for diverse student populations and include students in planning, programming, and participating in the programs. Now, what are some areas of concern and challenge? And I'll just list a couple. One is the heightened level of politics and court actions with a push by some to turn the clock backwards on affirmative action policies and diversity, against the pull of others in attempts to move forward for improvements in this arena. Note efforts, for example, by state legislatures to restrict voting among some groups, especially low-income and minority communities, and for controlling curriculum offerings, thereby blocking the teaching of some parts of history. Based not on factual representations, but talking points spewing hatred to frighten and control the narrative, where telling the truth among some public figures is a lost art and treated as irrelevant. Secondly, the practices in place that limit aggressive enrollment and academic success of people of color and women in certain schools and disciplines such as science, technology, engineering, mathematics, law, medicine fields, and even teaching. Low expectations. In closing, I want to remind us of a term, compare and contrast. On the one hand, we're dealing with, again, state and national level legislators across the country attempting to restrict or suppress the right to vote, and we're facing pushbacks on the teaching of certain aspects of history relative to slavery and Jim Crow laws, and practices and courts agree to restrictions on affirmative action. On the other hand, we can celebrate progress, such as the assignment of chief diversity officers in colleges and universities who wield authority and have adequate resources and policies in place for making a difference, and selection by Louisiana State University of the president, Dr. William F. Tate IV, who immediately upon the start of his tenure offered a full scholarship to a 14-year-old Louisiana native, Zaila Avant-Garde, 2021 winner of the Script Spelling Bee contest. By the way, not long afterwards, other colleges and universities made such similar offers, such as Southern University. Each one of us has a responsibility to contribute for leading the way for changes for a better way. Thanks to the 100 Black Men of America for producing this white paper on diversity and social justice in higher education and hosting the important conversation on this topic. I'm reminded of an old Negro spiritual as we move the needle forward. Ain't gonna let nobody turn me around. I won't sing it, but I'll say the words. Ain't gonna let nobody turn me around, turn me around, turn me around. Ain't gonna let nobody turn me around. I'm gonna keep on walking, keep on talking, marching to that freedom land. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Brown. Now we'll hear from Dr. Joseph Jones, and he's going to lead us through a summary of the white paper on virtual learning and distance education. And we want to just say thank you for all of you all who are tuning in. We see that we have representations from across the country, from the north, the south, the east, and the west. You are most welcome to this webinar. Dr. Jones.
Thank you, Dr. Silver, and thank you, Dr. Brown, for that very fascinating and most important discussion on social justice and diversity in this age. Our committee, our task was basically to talk about the challenges dealing with distance learning and virtual learning. We know that over about a year ago, COVID-19 happened, and it impacted higher education in such a way that many colleges and universities had to figure out how to continue on teaching and for students learning in an environment where a pandemic was existing. And so one of the things that we were really interested in doing is trying to understand what distance learning really is. What are some of the challenges with regards to providing distance learning or online learning? And then more specifically, what are some of the challenges the faculty were wrestling with throughout this whole entire pandemic? And so our part of the white paper was basically to discuss those three things: understanding distance education, the barriers and the challenges of distance learning, and then of course, challenges with faculty and teaching during the pandemic. And so our paper starts off by basically providing a somewhat historical account of what distance learning, or as it was called in the past, and online learning basically is. And distance learning itself is just basically learning from a distance, from a different space. The whole concept, the mode of distance learning is probably close to 30 or 40 years old. And just like every new trend with regards to learning and teaching, it started off with a very exclusive group of people who had access to a computer or the internet to be able to do that. And then of course it became very popularized, right? It became so much so that a lot of colleges, or some might say proprietary colleges, jumped on the bandwagon and began to start to create whole entire academic programs around distance learning or online learning, in many ways that was, some might say, even problematic, because there really was no checks or no balances or accountability systems to actually find out if actually students were actually learning what these programs, what they were saying were doing. But then as it evolved, probably within the last 15 or 20 years, online education or distance learning became virtual. And what we mean by virtual is primarily through the internet. And there are a lot of advantages of online learning or distance learning, right? I think one of the most unique things about online learning or distance learning is that it connects people to all across the world, right? So you could be a student in China taking a class in Germany, or you could be a student in Ghana taking a class in UCLA. And so it connects communities, it connects people, and actually exposes students to a body of knowledge that they no longer would have had access to. So that's one of the beauties of learning. But there are various ways when we start to really go down this rabbit hole to try to really understand, like, what are the major ways of online learning? So there's online, there's hybrid, and then there's what we call a presentation type of or conferencing mode of actually learning. The online is just basically it's it. As a college professor, I have taught online, where I would just set up in the system all the readings, all the lectures, and the student, him or herself, would just go through the process of just completing the assignments, reading, and actually doing everything in order to read. There was really no engagement between myself and the individual, but it was basically self-directed learning. And that was a way of actually engaging students, or an online platform. Hybrid platform is a little different. It's where students will actually come to class part of the time and actually interact with the professor, and then afterwards, and then do part of the rest of their time online, where they will actually complete assignments or do other kind of things. The last mode is the conferencing. And this is where this last year, where many of us have gotten actually really into this kind of mode, the Zoom classes, right? Or the team classes, or, the Google classes, where what we're doing right now, where we're conferencing with individuals and we're engaging them on that level. And each one of those modes have advantages and disadvantages. But overall, we believe that it's a very unique thing, but you have to take some time to really think through about how effective these platforms can be, specifically for the students that you're teaching. And so the second part of the paper talks about the barriers or the challenges. And so, as we said, online learning or distance learning is a very popular, but when we began to start to think about it in regards to who has access to a computer, right? Who has access, to high-speed internet? And what we find out is that a lot of Black and brown and just poor people themselves do not have access to those means and to those to online learning. And we saw this happening within the last year, right? I remember seeing news reports where you would have students who would, go to a Starbucks or go to a local library just to get access to an internet, to be able to do their homework, right? I've had students who did not have laptops who try to do their assignments on their phone. Because when you think about online learning, when you think about distance learning, one assumes that you'll have access to a desktop or to a laptop to be able to do it. But that's a challenge, that's a barrier for some of us, for specifically Black and brown communities. And so that came out early and about a year ago when schools began to shut down. And so colleges and universities, one of the things that they did, they began to actually just buy laptops and distribute them to their students so that they can complete their assignments. But even with that, another barrier, another challenge was basically digital literacy, right? We assume just because young people are young or faculty are smart, that we know how to navigate these spaces, right? That we know how to operate within a learning management system. And we found that there were tremendous challenges for students and faculty in regards to understanding what literacy is in regards to using these systems. And so all of these things came like a floodgate in this past year in regards to navigating those spaces. And one of the things that I think our committee really focused on, and specifically for policymakers, is basically what we're starting to see in the news right now. We begin to start talking about infrastructure, right? Building high-speed internet there ought to be a high-speed internet access to anybody or any child in America, because we know how vital it is for the internet, for the education, for our youth nowadays. And so one of the, I think, things that we really came to understand was that the internet or access or even just literacy was a huge problem or challenges during this time period. Now, the last part of the paper, we start talking about specifically faculty challenges, right? As a faculty member at a college and university, I can say first, tremendous challenges in regards to moving from an in-class experience to an online experience, right? Trying to keep the attention of students while teaching, right? Trying to make sure you even taking attendance, right? Trying to make sure that your students even had access to the material that was needed, right? And then you got to talk about, the technology issues that would happen. Sometimes the system just wouldn't work. So how do you have class then, right? But one of the things that I think has become universal now, wasn't almost a year ago, was that faculty had to reimagine the classroom and the virtual space, right? And so most faculty or all faculty are required to have a syllabus. And so we go back and look at our syllabus and say, how can we make this, intention to the space into the time in which we're teaching online? And so this new kind of term that came is called Zoom etiquette, right? Do I require my students to keep the camera on while I'm teaching, right? Make sure you're in a quiet space while we're actually learning. Make sure your name is up there. All these kind of little things we didn't have to think about when you're in the classroom, but in the virtual setting, you had to start thinking about those things. Also, when you start talking about or navigating specifically for faculty, learning management systems, right? A lot of us, but some of us were very familiar with ebooks, and a lot of the publishers that faculty use have ways for you to connect either books or lesson plans into the system. But if you weren't familiar with doing that, a lot of faculty had to figure out how to navigate that, right? How am I going to quiz a student on a lesson and make sure that there's integrity in the grading process, right? All of these issues were coming out in regards to faculty trying to understand and trying to navigate these spaces online. And I think it's been a challenge for many of us, but also an opportunity for us to think about how we can modernize our teaching and how we can keep engaging our students in a space so that there will not be any gaps in their learning. And so those were the things that our paper was really talking about, just really taking some time and understanding what distance learning is, online learning is, what are some of the barriers in regards to access or digital literacy, and more specifically, what faculty had to wrestle with during this time period. And I look forward to any questions or comments in regards to our part of the paper. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Dr. Jones. Let me say to those who are tuning in, each of these papers is on the website of the 100 Black Men of America. And I want to say thank you to Sharon Meadows and Ms. Dr. Ternice Mcneil for making all this happen for us, and also to Mr. Delmar Whittington, who is making this afternoon, this evening happen in real time. So the staff of the 100 has been very, very supportive of these efforts and facilitating our coming to you this evening. So what we're going to do now, we're going to spend about 10 or 15 minutes talking about diversity and social justice. And then we're going to spend about the equal amount of time talking about virtual learning. And we're going to ask all the panelists, whether you're on the paper or not, if you have some information you want to share, to please do so. But we're going to start off, and I'm going to ask Dr. Smith. We'll start with you. I'm just going to ask you a question. Anybody else want to chime in, please feel free to do so. But if you could, in a very short, brief statement, describe the evolution of diversity in higher education and the role that campus leaders played in pushing for change.
Well, thank you. Yes, that's an important question. And I think that one of the things we have to unpack here is how this all got started. And many of the diversity efforts got started through in the wake of the civil rights movement and in those years after that. And what was happening was that university presidents or leaders were actually appointing people who perhaps someone who was a person of color, an African American, to a position of a special assistant. And so that person was serving at the pleasure of the president and had limited kind of power, right? I mean, the goal was to create this bubble so that you could, with the students who were minoritized, could come to the campus and be safe, feel like they could be safe, but it doesn't change the campus. And that was the old model. And I think that what we've been trying to push over the years is a model that moves from that to one that we're actually embracing change. And what to speak to some of the things that my colleagues have talked about earlier is that transforming the campus, that diversity is for everyone and that everyone benefits. So I think that we are still on that journey, and it's been bumpy. And so I think that it's really important to understand that we still have a lot to do, because there's some campuses where diversity is seen as an option, right? And you can be involved or not, and that doesn't do a lot for you. That's kind of like a beginning stage. And then there's when it's actually diversity is something where there's these competing enclaves, where there's the Black students or the Latinx students or what have you, the Asian students are competing for limited resources. And then there's the goal we want to seek and to achieve is that one where diversity is embraced by everyone and everyone wins, and it's not it's a way of enhancing the entire campus community and the environment.
Thank you. Any other panelists want to weigh in on that question? Any other panelists want to weigh in on that question? If not, we'll go to the next question. And I'm going to ask Dr. Kirkendall if he would kind of lead us into this particular question. Something that Dr. Roland Smith said that kind of triggered my thinking on this. And for our audience, we're really focusing in on higher education on both of these topics. So, Dr. Kirkendall, many campuses, as Dr. Smith has said, had hired chief diversity officers. How should this person engage with the campus and create inclusive organizational space for faculty, staff, and students?
Yeah, thank you. Very important question. In this particular climate that we're in, many large companies and many higher education institutions alike have started to look more closely at this position and what it should be. 2020 taught us a lot about mental health, safety, viruses, and the impact that it can have on the world. But we also had a difficult racial climate that we had to recognize, and for many individuals, the first time in their lives. And so, what companies wanted to do, in many respects, is bring a key person in that understood how to navigate the spaces within their organizations. Now, higher education has been doing this for some while, as Dr. Smith has said, but it's often been at a level where it didn't have the elevated platform that it needed to get things done. And so now we're starting to see that, which shows promise. These positions on campuses, particularly in majority institutions, can often be very underfunded and unrecognized. And so now what we're asking chief diversity officers to do when they arrive on campuses is be a true leader for equity and inclusion and recognize what that truly means. When we talk about everyone having equality, equity, it's everybody having the same thing. But when you talk about inclusion, does it work well for everybody, even though you have the same things? It's the whole everybody has a pair of shoes, but does the shoe that you have fit, right? So it's really about making sure that the shoe that you have fits in the environment that you're in. This person needs to be very closely connected to the president of the university or the chancellor or the CEO. They should be walking hand in hand in terms of their vision and mission for the campus. And so, as the other important piece is the selection of this person. You know, there should be nationwide searches for these individuals, and not to, strategically appoint someone who's already within the system that is a person of color to take on this role. We often see that happen. If you want an expert, if you want someone that has been trained and ready to do the job, if you're serious about the work, then you're serious about hiring somebody that you may not know personally, someone that can come in and really be an advocate and a voice for the faculty, the staff, and the students as it pertains to equity and inclusion on their campus.
Thank you. And we're blessed to have on this platform with us someone who's in such a position, Dr. Derek Rivera. So you want to weigh in on that question, Dr. Rivera?
Yeah, and my colleague Roland Smith is also in the same position over at Rice University. One of the things that I advocate is that while we have these positions, as Roland articulated, and John furthered a bit, I think that the chief diversity officer of any organization should be the chief operating officer, or the president, the chancellor, or the CEO of that organization. Now, you certainly need people in the roles that Roland and I occupy to do the work, but the chief champion for diversity, equity, and inclusion has to start at the top. And it has to be a message that's given not just by chief diversity officers, those of us hired to do the work, but certainly by the leaders of these organizations and these institutions. I appreciate the conversation thus far as we look at the evolution, and it's curious where these positions will end up. One of the more salient points, and I don't want to have you gloss over that John brought out, is often people will look left and right and find the nearest person of color and say that, and it's sometimes the only person of color, or the person of color who's been there the longest, and they make them a chief diversity officer, and they have no real training or understanding about the breadth and depth of diversity.
So while we're on this topic, why is diversity even important in higher education? Um, since you had the floor, Dr. Rivera, why don't you start that conversation, and I want other folk to chime in.
Sure, sure. Diversity is important in higher education for some of the reasons that Dr. Brown articulated in his intro. It is a necessary component for success in the future. And I think if we peel back the layers of higher education, most of our institutions are getting people ready for success in the future, whatever that looks like, whether they be physicians, teachers, engineers, architects. We want our graduates to be successful. They're going to work in a world that has become increasingly diverse. It has become more than just a black and white spectrum. It has brown, it has Asian, it has Native American, it has LGBTQ plus, it has international flavor that the pandemic has taught us that we can be, as Dr. Jones mentioned earlier, we can be in Ghana and conversing with somebody in Shanghai and have a similar conversation with somebody in Los Angeles. This world is a much smaller place than the one that any of us were born into. And it's smaller because of the global connectivity. And if you're not paying attention to that connectivity, if you're not paying to the diversity that is going to be in the workplace, you're not going to be successful. So higher education, as we prepare people for success in the future, has to deliver on that. We have to make that part of the training, not just the academic component of learning, but the societal engagement, the ability to network and work with others from different backgrounds.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. So also, when we know that with the increase of diversity on campuses, there's been demands by students to have equal access to resources, and rightfully so. But not only that, but faculty members too. And we also see that issues in the larger society impact the campus itself. So this whole social justice movement that's going on in communities across the country are also finding themselves on college campuses. So with that, I want to ask Professor Hardy, if he would, to just kind of lead us into a discussion in terms of why should one even be concerned about social justice, whether on campuses or in the community. Unmute yourself, Professor Hardy.
Sorry. Thank you, Dr. Silva. It's a very important segue because of the fact that when we talk about social justice, we really have 5 tenets that we're dealing with. First one is access, equity, participation, diversity, and then we have human rights. So the whole gamut of what it takes in putting together a successful situation will involve a good mix of social justice. Any area of development that our students are going to have to go out into various careers, they're going to be dealing with these attributes that we talked about. Now, let me just give you one example that's right before us now in the Olympics. I was interested in knowing that the swimmers, particularly the African American ladies, have an issue with the cap they have to use. It's not working for them. So an African American company came up with the cap, but it didn't get approved. Now, that's access to capital. And so in order for them to be equal players in the economic arena, they must get justice in order that their products can be fairly looked at, look at the points they're talking about, so they can be on the market. That's just one example that's before us right now. So in the total arena of things as we see it today, we cannot navigate through the economy that we have without coming in contact with those tenets of social justice. So it's not an either or if we're going to have equality those attributes have to be respected. So that's why we say, you know what, so what, now what? We got to do something with it.
Anybody else want to weigh in on that particular question? Anybody else? Yes, sir.
I guess,
Dr. Smith.
yeah, I just wanted to say that we know one of the things that we have to face is that there are challenges. Every time we have some major advancement in justice, social justice, and equity, there's this pushback. And so we're at a period now where there's a lot of pushback because there are people who in power and have privilege who feel that anyone else's gain is their loss. And we can't ignore that challenge. That's there.
Well, I think you're right. And now that the demand for social justice is really in front of us on a daily basis, and folk are trying to put it into a historical context, we now have people who are trying to rewrite the history.
Exactly.
And they're really talking about the elimination of critical race theory as a conversation in colleges and K through 12. And so, Dr. Jones, I might want you to just say a few words about that and then use that as a segue into maybe moving into our virtual learning discussion.
Can you say that one more time?
Yes, I was asking Dr. Jones if he would give us some kind of commentary as a political scientist on this whole issue to silence and rewrite history and to eliminate critical race theory from curriculums.
Yeah. Thanks for the setup. So, this whole debate about, diversity, inclusion, and equity, and specifically dealing with critical race theory, it's an old debate, right? It's not something that's really, really new. And what for me, this question is it's almost like a false question, right? Because it assumes that it already happened, right? We know that our history is replete with omissions, right? We know that history that has been written about, America and America's standing, not only with dealing with its own citizens, but even internationally, has been in many ways whitewashed or taught in a way that is not honest, right? And so this new boogeyman about critical race theory, about stopping something that is already happening, to me is just completely disingenuous, right? Because we know if we look at the textbooks, if we look at what is going on and what's being taught in schools, it's already happening. And so, but the bigger question is, how do we not so much just rewrite, but fill in the gaps to teach an honest history about what exactly happened? Because this is what I think is really, really frustrating for me, not only just as a political scientist, but just as a Black person living here in America, that we know that when we look at symbols like the Confederacy and the the Confederate flag and all of those things, that it conjures up a certain narrative, right, about Black people, African people in this country, and what place we ought to be in, right?
Well, that's exactly why I wanted to call on you, because I wanted you to put that in perspective. I know you wouldn't have expected that, but now I'm going to segue to Dr. Johnny Brown, because he was superintendent of several school districts. And I want to know, what do you think about this discussion, Dr. Brown, from a person who sits in the top seat as a school superintendent?
Okay. I certainly do have opinions. A lot of this discussion is about race, class, and quality of life. And it's about talking points in politics in terms of who is going to be in charge, who's going to be powerful in powerful positions. But as all of you on this panel know, and perhaps everyone who has signed in to the program knows that critical race theory is not even an area that's taught in the K through 12 school system.
That's right.
That's correct.
But it's a college course specifically for law students in certain categories of law. But it's been turned into, like Dr. Jones just said, like a boogeyman, that there's something wrong or bad about what's being taught to our children out there. And it's been challenging for some school districts, more than others, where people have been fed misinformation and then they act upon it. And I think a lot of it's deliberate to get people riled up in a manner that will lead toward state legislatures doing what some of them are doing, just to say that because people are riled up, therefore we got to take action. The action you take is just put in rules not to allow history to be taught in the first place, except for celebrating what white people have done, the good, positive things that people want to focus upon, not the things that are, dealing with racial injustice and segregation. So it is a challenge out there, and I think papers and discussions like we're holding right now, the papers that we just developed, and holding these kind of conversations for the public to tune in to participate, I think are really critical, because a lot of it is, again, as has been already stated, about history that's already happened. Everybody should know what's happened, but there are people out there who want to block that information from getting fed to our children or shared with our children.
Thank you. I want to kind of shift the conversation just a little bit to this whole issue of distance learning and virtual education. And I kind of want to list it in a way or talk about a transition in a way that can continue this discussion. And so, Dr. Mcneil, I'm going to ask you this question. What are some of the institutional and systemic barriers that exist related to distance education?
Well, there are several, right? And just to answer that in brief and to tie it into this discussion, I hope to maybe kind of go through the systematic and the institutional briefly, just to kind of bring it back around to policy perspective and how that might help us to get beyond some of these critical issues that are plaguing many of our students, particularly those who are poor and those who are Black and brown. So to look at it from a systematic standpoint, my colleague, Dr. Jones, spoke about the origins of what we know now as an opportunity gap, once called a digital divide, right? Some still refer to that. And then these gaps in computer literacy really kind of had their origins in a socioeconomic divide, where the first personal computers that were accessible in the homes were really very expensive. And so only those who could afford them were able to place them in their homes in the late 80s and the early 90s. So then initial divide was created where some folks were ahead of others in becoming more comfortable with the use of the personal computer. Over time, computing prices and those types of things, the price to access computers and the internet went down, but there was still a great head start from certain communities who were able to have those. So to gloss over that quickly, that's kind of also been exasperated in our ability to access broadband, as Dr. Jones also said. Really a very, very key and critical point that kind of leads to how computing and for that matter, most subjects are taught in both our K-12 and higher ed realms. The approach of using computers by educators is critically important, but this divide in the computer literacy must also be navigated as we teach our students.
So I'm going to ask Dr. Yancey to weigh in on this. And Dr. Yancey, one of the questions I want you to kind of delve into is, we know that there's been an increase in the use of distance education during COVID-19, but do you think this is a temporary phenomena, or is this something that's going to be ongoing?
Okay, my mic's on now. Thanks for asking that question, Dr. Silva. I think it's an important question. Dr. Jones indicated in his presentation the origin of the whole distance learning phenomenon, and it had been around sort of as an underground education mechanism by schools that for people who couldn't afford, who thought they couldn't afford to attend college in person. They would offer what we used to call, well, I won't say what we used to call them, but they were degree programs that, as Dr. Jones said, may or may not have had the rigor, academic rigor that was that those of us in mainstream universities cherish. But COVID came and it sort of drove the technology. It sort of forced everyone to do something that had been done by essentially the outlaws for all these years. And as a result of that, then we have learned to use distance education, and particularly to use 21st century technology in distance education to create quality educational programs. The reality is that these programs don't work for everyone. The personalities of the individuals participating have to be such that they can deal with a level of situations that are not completely clear and concise. Some people need the hand-holding of a faculty member, for example. In many cases, students can deal with ambiguity. They don't have the faculty member, but they've got a syllabus and they've got a reading list, and they can do it. And universities have discovered that by using the technologies of distance education, they can reach a lot more people. And for both the proprietary schools and the mainstream schools, reaching more people means generating more revenue through at least tuition, if not from room and board and those kinds of services. So now it's most likely that most of the mainstream universities are going to bring students back on campus, to go back to doing the traditional in-person education, but at the same time, they're going to retain the distance learning model for those students who, for whatever reasons, cannot or are not willing to come back to campus.
Any other panelists want to weigh in on this? Dr. Mcneil?
Yeah, I do want to just kind of follow up on that in terms of the institutional issues that we face in terms of funding, right? So school funding, I think, is another very critical policy point of consideration. One of the critical things, just to kind of meld these conversations between social justice and computing, technology, virtual learning, is one of the policy initiatives or one of the policies I think should be really looked at moving forward is the fact that property values in communities have a direct correlation with the amount of funding that the districts provide to schools within those areas. I think that's where a lot of the digital divide and virtual learning divide is perpetuated, in the fact that certain schools are simply not as technologically equipped to deliver instruction as others. And so I just think that in most of these debates, it's critical to keep in consideration where the funding comes from to sustain and facilitate some of these efforts. And some of that is more systematic, and that's a thing that some policy makers and leaders could consider moving forward with crafting legislation about these things.
Since you raised that issue in terms of some of the funding issue, I'm going to go back to Dr. Jones and see if you can expound upon some of the other barriers that exist in terms of that persisted during this virtual learning during this last year, and also what should we be demanding of our public officials in terms of trying to address some of these barriers?
Yeah, specifically dealing with challenges is, something that has to be sorted out. I mean, it was always an issue in higher education, and that's an issue of mental health, right? A lot of my students, in teaching them over the year, really have to wrestle with, isolation, anxiety, And I think that, you know, as we're coming out, where everybody's trying to, you know, get back to normal or whatever, but I think that it's done COVID's done a task, not only just on the students, even for our faculty. For many of us who have families trying to homeschool, trying to teach, like there has to be some intentional efforts to actually deal with the mental state of our students and our faculty. And as far as policymakers around the issues of, I think, you know, as a part of this infrastructure package, I mean, high speed, it should be access for everybody, whether you're in rural or urban. And I'll even go farther and say it should be free. It should be something that everybody should have access to. It should, and because I think it's such a vital thing for that divides people on who's successful and who is not successful. As
Okay,
as influential people, we need to push policymakers to that conversation.
thank you, thank you. Dr. Yancey, given what you've heard from those individuals who have talked about the distance learning, the barriers and what have you, from your perspective, is distance learning and virtual education, is it getting better, is it worse, or is it not good at all? Unmute yourself, please.
I think as a result of our experience this past year, it's gotten a whole lot better. Let me just go back a minute and remind myself out loud that when I was working in the University System of Georgia, the chancellor and the Board of Regents decreed that we would do distance education. This was back in the 1990s, late 1990s, because they want to be able to have school without having to build buildings. So, but fortuitously for them, COVID forced us into this mode, and I expect it's going to continue. But again, because we have the possibility of doing conferencing as we're doing now for classes, where students can actually speak face to face with the teacher via the internet. We're going to have discussions and ask questions and answer questions and have some kind of virtual interaction as opposed to what we did in the past when we used the US mail system to sort of have education. Then I think that technology has enabled us to do it better. And I think that there's a motivation on the side of policymakers to do it better. So with the technology and the motivation, and there are students who love it. There are students who thoroughly enjoy sitting in front of the computer all day, working their assignments, and don't really feel the need to have a whole lot of interaction with other human beings, which I think is dangerous, but that's a different discussion. Back to one Dr. Jones said about mental health. But yeah, I believe that we're doing it better now. I believe it's getting better and going to get better, and it's going to be around for a while.
All right, let's go to some of the questions from our audience, and anybody on the panel can respond to these questions. We have a question from Robbie, and he says that policy will be too slow for the children who have lost almost 2 academic years. And the question is, are there any nonprofit or private initiatives to help parents help parents help their children catch up?
Well, I would say that, you know, at least the 100 Black Men of Atlanta, you know, through our Project Success and our mentoring programs, has been working on this and continues to work on this with a limited number of students. And of course, there are other organizations in our communities, fraternities and sororities and civic organizations, and sometimes even religious organizations that have been working on providing at least a minimal level of mentoring and some level of formal or informal education for kids, you know, to sort of help them try to catch up from what they've lost in this last year when they didn't have in-person learning.
Right. Now, Dr. Mcneil, I saw you want to weigh in on this, but before you weigh in, I just want to remind the audience, if you have questions, put them in the chat and we will ask those questions on your behalf. Dr. Mcneil, you had something to say about the last question from our audience.
Yes, sir. I mean, we certainly know that there are lots of organizations in the trenches, a lot of fraternities, and a lot of the, local organizations, right, that are doing this work. But one of the larger, I guess, organizations I could think of would be TRIO programs, as they do a good job across the board through their educational talent search, their upward bound math and science programs, and their student success services. And they are funded quite well through government contracts to provide computing labs and those types of things in a lot of communities, particularly those around colleges and a lot of them near HBCUs. So I would say seek TRIO out as well.
Any other panelists want to weigh in on that?
Yes, sir. I'd like to just add briefly that in the state of Indiana, legislation was passed this year to approve $150 million for COVID recovery learning for students. And so this was the first summer that was put into place. We've got 2 years. We'll see how next year shakes out. But the ultimate goal is to help those students who have been in a position of not being active learners during the pandemic, would have an opportunity to get back into a formalized school setting and be taught and provided some of the resources that they may not have gotten when they were in the learning of virtual learning experience. It was different for everybody in terms of some students flourished in this environment, but many of our marginalized students did not. And so we're going to see, for those of us in higher education, if the ramp up or the catch up, however you want to term it, does not increase by the time they enter college, you're going to see a consistent drop off of our freshmen being able to kind of meet the college rigor if we don't address their academic abilities and what they've lost for over a year and a half, particularly at the high school level. So there's work that needs to be done. And I'm pleased that in our state, we're addressing it with an active bill through legislation.
Dr. Brown, I saw your hand raised.
Yes, I would just add that the government, through the Elementary Secondary School Emergency Relief Fund Act, also has provided millions of dollars to support school districts across the nation. So I would suggest to that person who asked the question to go to the local school district to see what funds are available from the federal government as it passed down through the states for such purpose.
Thank you. We have another question from the audience. He's agreeing with the statement that was made by Robbie, but he's asking us a question on the other side of the coin. He is saying, is there anyone tracking what has been gained during the last 2 years?
I was going to weigh in on that. I think, well, first I will say one of my soapbox speeches, and that is, as we look at this last year and a half, we tend to focus on COVID and its effects, but the pain and the stain of a political season like none other that has divided this country will probably have more lasting effects than COVID, save for the actual death of so many folks in this country. But I think this political divide will be humongous, and this should have been a game. It should have been a game, but it actually is just a huge step backwards. We also have seen the racial unrest, and we've seen climate change, and all kinds of things buried on top of this. And so what has happened, the gains have been given to those who are already ahead. Those who started out last year ahead moved further ahead, and those who started out behind moved further behind. And this two year educational gap that was referenced in the earlier question, I think it's going to linger. It's going to linger. We had kids in schools who returned to a virtual learning and sometimes in-person learning with tutors immediately as we were closing other schools. We had kids with tutors. We had college professors tutoring high school students and elementary school students because they weren't working at the universities, but they weren't at the schools where our kids are. And so I think the gains were made by those who were already ahead. The other point I want to make, and we had a little bit of a conversation about mental health. For some students, being in a virtual environment, I think it was alluded to, but I want to drive the point. For some students, it's a much more comfortable environment to be in a virtual environment than in a classroom where social pressures and being forced to perform inhibits learning. And so I do want to put that out there, that there are some folks for whom this online learning delivery is the optimal way for them to learn.
And I might just add, if I can add to that,
yes, sir.
Take it back to the university level. because what we're discussing now at the undergrad, at the secondary school level, where the kids' level of maturity are much lower than at the college and the graduate level, that the distance learning or the virtual education process has been found to be very valuable for lots of people who are in grad school and who are in particular upper class undergrad school, because it allows them the flexibility to sometimes work and to also maintain their academic progress in school. And because of this, that's got some level of increased desirability that they were unaware of until they had this experience this last 2 years.
Okay, Dr. Hardy, did you want to weigh in on that?
Yes, I think that one of the assets that we have to maximize, it's been alluded to earlier, we got to better organize what we do in terms of the capabilities that we have in shared knowledge. Organizations that we've been talking about, all of them have some level of mentoring and the like. We got to fine tune those institutions and organizations and get better focused until we get a better instrument to deliver. Right now, that's what we have at our availability. We got to use those smarter.
Yeah, so audience, if you still have questions, we're trying to monitor your questions as you come in while we're scrolling down, looking at your question. I have another question for the panelists. Given what we talked about the issues of distance learning and the barriers, and we talked about social justice, what is the connection between social justice and economic empowerment? Professor Hardy, I'm going to ask you to lead us on that, and then anybody else want to chime in?
Well, social justice is really the gateway, if you want to categorize that way, to economic empowerment, because when you think about those tenets that's necessary to get into empowerment, economic empowerment, you have to start with access. If you can't gain access, you can't get participation, then you won't ever get to economic empowerment. That's one of the things that, in terms of creating relationships, various connections, networking, it's important that we have an organized system. Three things move anything. It's organization, teamwork, and communication. We have to employ that within structures of organizations that we control. We got to share. And I think that there's a lot of value when we share with one another, come out of these silos, let's focus on the problem, and let's come up with some solutions that we all have when we come together collectively. In other words, we have to learn to make the collective ask on whatever's going on. It's got to come out of isolation. It's for the good of the order, for a collective impact. So that's what I suggest that we get better at as we go forward. We can do it.
Anyone else want to weigh in on that, the connection between social justice and economic empowerment?
I just wanted to add that we need to make sure that we build these things. We actually have to have a way to measure our success, because that helps us to make the case even moving further down the line. So this last year we had to do this. A year ago we had to do a quick pivot, right? There wasn't a mechanism in place to help us to monitor, to see how to weigh the benefits of what we're doing and the challenges of what we had to do.
Okay. If anybody in the audience have a question, post it in the chat. If not, I'm going to ask another question. Anyone can respond to this. We saw a lot of commentary this past year on the say for an example, the Tulsa situation. Suppose that Black community did not have that catastrophic event to occur. What do you think would have been the economic benefit from continuous legacy of businesses and schools and communities without the interruption of things like happened in Tulsa and Wilmington and New York and Louisiana. Somebody want to tackle that?
I'll start with that. I think that it's obvious that the system saw a successful program moving and they tackled it. They interrupted it. You think about the fact that most of our history, and I know that my coming through high school, nobody talked about the 1921 massacre in terms of what took place at that time. Well, and here again, that has to do with a student developing context and perspective on what's taking place with him. That's a part of your growth and development. And so when you're looking at the massacre of 1921, the system set back a whole community, a society that was going to be a pattern. Even over here, Booker T. Washington had some ideas about that as he visited that area. Right here in Tuskegee, there's a community, goes the Greenwood community. It was going to be a model that was going to be replicated. And so here again, the system, if it sees a way to interrupt success, they know how to go at the juggler. And so that's a major problem. An African American had a 54-room hotel over there. I think the brother's name is Stratford. They took it down, started. And so here again, that was a major setback in the economic development and the economic empowerment that would have been on a successful run had the massacre not taken place.
Yeah, and let me kind of clarify something that's in the chat. We have someone who was saying that when we talked about gains, we were talking about academics. The question that was being responded to had to do with the gains in terms of learning in the environment of distance learning versus face-to-face learning. Because what the question in the panelist is saying, he wants to challenge us to speak to the core relational tenets that are required for social justice movements. So I think his question is very different from what the question that we were trying to respond to. Now, we can respond to that question in terms of the core relational tenets that are required for social justice movements. So if anybody want to tackle that question, but I wanted to be clear with the person who made that comment that we were not tackling social justice in terms of gains. We were talking about gains or losses as relates to school children in the midst of the pandemic using virtual education. But since you raised that as an issue, panelists, audience, let us tackle that for you. And his question is, what are some of the core tenets that are required for a social justice movement? Let's take it head on.
Dr. Silver, I'll take that on. First, I want to thank Mr. Gaskin for leaning in, right, into this discussion, right, and forcing us all to think more critically about these issues. And this is not really just a 100 Black men perspective or, educated Black man perspective. This is really a community conversation that we should be having, and I certainly appreciate him for being here. Now, I'll try to do some justice to that, and my colleagues will chime in with me, but I'm reminded when I look at this question of last year's activities around George Floyd and Breonna Taylor protests, et cetera. There was a window of time where I believe, the nation was really attuned and listening in to what was happening here. And there was an opportunity to put forth very critical issues. And we did deal with some very critical things as it was, the Confederate monument debate came into play, and there's place for some of that discussion. But I think we might have missed a critical opportunity, right, to be engaged in the real work of social justice reform in bringing to attention the disparity within our schools and with the education of our youth, right, and how our schools, again, are funded, right, and how our schools are supported and the opportunity gaps that exist. Some of those questions did not really make the main floor of the discussions that took place while we received some gains in a few things, some of the symbolic things that might bother us, but the true fundamental tenets of what it would take for reform on social justice, I think, went unattended to, and a lot of that had to do with education. So maybe some of the takeaway from this discussion is that in order to do that, we do focus on the education of our youth, as there's still some serious looming perennial issues related to the opportunity gap.
We have another question from the audience, and that question is, have we dropped the ball on educating our own in an effort to be accepted rather than empowered? Anybody want to take that on?
I'll take it on for a minute.
Okay.
I think that we may not have dropped the ball, but I think that we have to maintain focus and balance. We were striving for diversity, but I think that we need to understand, who we are principally serving at all times. And so we can carry the diversity method forward, but at the same time, what we're talking about today is providing better context and better perspective so our students will have a greater thirst to know the significance of certain things they need to do in order to succeed. So I think we can do the two simultaneously, but we'll be cognizant of the balance.
All right. Anybody else want to weigh in on that, Dr. Brown?
Well, I just want to make a general comment before we close. And I want everybody who is listening and members of the panel, I'm going to raise the question, then I'll comment. Which is more important and more relevant, power, wealth, or race? Or is each one important in terms of moving the ball forward for our people? And obviously they're all important, but part of the response, I think, that would be important to convey in this conversation is we've all got to vote. We've all got to vote. Everybody in this panel, everybody who's listening has got to vote to move as part of moving the needle forward. There's so many people. What is it that legislatures, others are doing across the nation that was referenced earlier, trying to prevent people from voting? Which people and why those people why are they trying to prevent certain people from voting? Is because they people who are in that arena of trying to turn the clock backwards are trying to hold on to power, and power is connected to wealth, and too much of it is about race. So again, I'm just trying to encourage us all in terms of what to do moving forward. Vote, encourage people at your church or synagogue to join together. As Professor Harder was saying earlier, work together with your social organizations. Go on Twitter, Facebook, or whatever platform, social media you work with, to encourage our people to vote and to participate in this, and to participate in conversations beyond. We have these conversations for an hour and a half, and then all of a sudden nothing happens of significance. You, each one of us, be the person that's the driver of keeping this kind of conversation going forward.
Yeah. And our time is about out. And so rather than, I'm going to take the privilege of the chair, of the moderator, and rather than us going around having closing statement, there's another couple of questions in the chat, and we don't want to respond to those. And this one is kind of interesting, and I would really like to hear your take on this. We have a question in chat that says, you talked about diversity positions that are being created and being intentional about not filling positions with the closest person or the next to you. What would you suggest we do if we are the ones who have been asked to do this, and we know we do not have the skill set to carry this role out?
I saw that question.
I would say, can I say something there?
Yes. Good, Roland.
Yeah.
And then
So
yes.
I mean, the first thing is to find outside networks. There's the National Association of Diversity Officers in Higher Education, and they have a wealth of resources that on their website. And so I think that's one thing, not to do your research and go beyond your campus. and see what others are doing, so that you can actually begin to come back and bring that knowledge back and say, this is what we need to be doing at our institution.
Derek, did you want to weigh in on that? And I see Dr. Yancey has his hand up too.
Yeah, I saw that question. I was not going to let it pass. That's too good of a question. But before I answer that, I saw one when we started. Somebody asked if there was 100 Black men program for young people, and there are a number of programs. And I would suggest that if you want to know more about those programs, so much of what we do is mentoring and providing access for young people. I would suggest you contact your local 100 Black Men of America chapter, and you can learn much more about that. But to answer that question specifically, Roland mentioned NATAHE. There are other state organizations that are part of NATAHE. So whatever state you're in, look to your state organization if you can't make it to the nationals. You also need to, and he nailed it. When you look to do that kind of work, you've got to get busy trying to educate yourself on every aspect of diversity, not just the aspect that you represent, but all aspects of diversity. That can be done through training programs. That can be done through the networking that Roland mentioned. It can include partnering with other local folks who are doing it, because here in Baton Rouge, we just developed a local group of diversity officers, some in education, some in private sector, some in public corporation, government and public organizations. And so there are a number of ways in which you can get the information. But I would challenge you to get that and get yourself skilled enough so that you can move the diversity, equity, and inclusion platform the way it should be, not just because you were a representative of one of those groups.
Dr. Yancey, you said you want to weigh in on that? You're muted.
I'd like to weigh in because an alternate approach to that is to do what you said in your chat, to acknowledge to your employer, well, listen, I'm not really very well versed or well trained or up to speed on this. Let me work with you on putting together a search committee so we can define the criteria for a well-informed person. And I can help, select someone, help us search for someone. Because we, at this point, if we start on your facility, on your campus or in your business or wherever you are, and you've got to get up to speed, then the time is taken for you to get up to speed is time that important milestones are not being met. If we can bring someone in who's already versed and experienced in this area, then they can hit the ground running. Your contribution can be to help define the job description and help conduct the search.
You were saying the same thing I was thinking. There's one last, we got 2 minutes, and there's a question about, is there a youth leadership program in the 100? And the answer is yes. You have the Collegiate 100, you have other organizations where you have in the chapters where they have youth groups from high school, from elementary school to middle schools, where they are creating opportunities for young people to be empowered in leadership and what have you. And as we leave, I have one of my panelists who said they want to say a last word. So I'm going to give that to Dr. Mcneil. Dr. Mcneil?
Well, I'm not quite sure if that was the message, but I will say this, that, if we continue to have these community discussions, continue to engage with people around these critical issues, I think that that we will continue to put forth the sort of pressure that is needed to motivate policy, to motivate communities to work together, and to do this heavy lift together for the betterment of the youth that we're so intent upon helping. So thank you, sir.
Well, our time is out. I want to say thank you to those who came in as the audience. Know that this will also be on YouTube and Facebook, so you can see it probably in delayed form. Share it with everybody. Thank you for your comments, audience. But I also want to thank the panelists, because what you saw this evening is just a small piece of the work that they've been doing for over a year. Prior to that, the same group did papers on access to higher education graduation rates, accreditation. So we've been functioning as a higher education committee. All of those papers are on the web at the 100. We want to thank the 100 staff for helping us get this out to you. We want to thank Mr. Whittington for making sure all the electronics work, that we could bring this to you. And again, to the panelists, you guys are awesome. You guys are frontline workers, frontline soldiers, and I want to thank each of you. Everybody have a good night, stay safe, and we love you all, and hopefully we can come back to you in another forum. Thank you very much.
Get vaccinated.
Get vaccinated.